Hello and welcome to African Perspective here on SABC News Channel 404. Welcome back from the holiday seasons, and I hope that it was a good year for you coming in and that it's looking up for you all round. 2019 is going to be another significant year of transition in the region, with general elections in several countries, including in South Africa, and the outcome of poll results expected in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And just on that note, there's news in saying that the results we hear they're expected to be announced from 11 p.m. Central African time. Our sister program, The Globe, will be keeping a keen eye on that development and will bring you the latest. Now, we're also keeping a close eye on Gabon and the Sudan. Coming up today, though, we look at Africa's oldest liberation movement, the African National Congress. It's turned 107 on Tuesday. The ANC was formed with the purpose of uniting Africans, not only in what is known as, or was known as, the frontline states and the SADC region, but in the diaspora as well. That's why many leaders and monarchs attended the launch of the party in Windhoek in Bloemfontein in the Free State. The song that you're hearing now, Liza Listingalako, was sung by clergy and others gathered in 1912 at the event. So, though the ANC was also instrumental in the founding of the Organization of African Unity, one of the first things it did on the cusp of democracy was be a legitimate member of the OAU in 1993. Now, let's look at the party's various ties in Africa and other strategic countries from which it carried out its various business and operations. We will be joined later on in studio by Lindiwe Zulu, head of the ANC's International Relations Committee, and Lebohang Peku, political economist and senior research fellow at Trade Collective. First, though, let's take a look at some of the reports sent by the SABC's foreign desk on this very anniversary. We start in London. So for decades, London was a key center for the ANC and other liberation movements. Oliver Tambo and his family lived in exile in the British capital for 30 years as he rallied international forces against the apartheid regime. His message particularly resonated with a generation who came of age in the 1980s under the government of British leader Margaret Thatcher, who eventually reversed her support for the apartheid regime and welcomed Nelson Mandela to Downing Street. Catherine Drew takes a look back at the relationship between the UK and the ANC.
South Africa House sits on Trafalgar Square in the very heart of London. Today it is a symbol of a democratic independent nation, a friend to the UK. But that wasn't always the case.
Well, you're looking at my father, you're looking at Jesse Jackson.
Last year, South Africa's High Commissioner to the UK, Thembi Tambo, daughter of Oliver Tambo, showed me the murals of the anti-apartheid protests that were a weekly occurrence in Trafalgar Square for decades.
I don't think the British people know that this is what they did.
Under ANC leader in exile Oliver Tambo, and helped by many in Britain's opposition Labour Party, calls for the release of Nelson Mandela slowly gained widespread public support, culminating in the 1980s with concerts and trade and sporting boycotts. Former editor-in-chief of South Africa's Sunday Independent newspaper, journalist John Battersby, has spent decades covering UK-South Africa relations.
It is true to say that the Conservative Party government regarded the ANC as a terrorist organisation and therefore, by implication, its leader as a terrorist. Margaret Thatcher actually never herself used the words Mandela is a terrorist, but the briefing from her officials like Sir Bernard Ingham and so forth left no doubt that that's what she thought.
Under intense public pressure, the government of Margaret Thatcher reversed course, eventually welcoming Nelson Mandela to Downing Street in 1990. If the British government's attitude towards the ANC pre-independence was dominated by Margaret Thatcher through a crucial era, it is Britain's second female Prime Minister, Theresa May, that has overseen a warming of relations.
The past is never forgotten completely, so there would be a different quality of relationship between the ANC and the Conservative Party to what there is with the Labour Party. But definitely it has warmed, and you saw when Theresa May went on her visit to South Africa latest last year, She went out of her way to, although she didn't turn out to be the greatest dancer of all time, she went out of her way to, as a gesture, to show her solidarity.
Today, Nelson Mandela's statue sits opposite Parliament alongside the likes of Gandhi and Winston Churchill. He remains a much-loved and respected figure in the UK and a symbol of the UK's storied relationship with the ANC. Catherine Drew, SABC News, London.
And we go to Russia now, one of the countries that played a decisive role in the ANC's history in Russia. The Soviet Union trained thousands of ANC members in guerrilla warfare and provided them with a base where no other country would host them. Dan Ashby sent this report from Moscow.
Well, it may sometimes feel as if snowy sub-zero Moscow is a whole world away from South Africa, but that seat of power behind me has been right by the ANC's side for decades. The Soviet Union sent hundreds of thousands of dollars to help with Nelson Mandela's legal defense and to support other ANC activists. But that was just the start of it. The Soviet Union was among a handful of countries, for instance, to work with the top brass of the ANC, giving them advice, support and recognition at the highest levels of government. But most notably, they also helped to train up the ANC's military wing. More than 2,000 cadres came either here to Russia or to Ukraine to learn the art of guerrilla warfare. And when their fighters were expelled from other African countries, it was the Soviet Union who stepped in. Indeed, many historians believe the Soviet Union was the ANC's most important foreign ally. In more recent years, the relationship has been more controversial, with Russia's bid to build nuclear power stations in South Africa being declared unlawful and President Zuma's closeness to President Putin coming under some fire. But the countries in 2019 remain close. They hope to improve their relations through the trading bloc known as BRICS. And as South Africa's foreign minister recently put it, South Africa owes a big debt of gratitude to Russia. Dan Ashby, SABC News, Moscow.
We'll talk about those relations between the former Soviet Union and the South African governing party. But let's go to the continent now. Tanzania hosting some of the ANC's members during the apartheid years as well. It set up one of the main bases in Mazimbo in Morogoro region, which grew into an exiled organization carrying forth thousands of members and party's armed wing Umkhonto weSizwe as well. The SABC's Daniel Kijo has more.
The ANC is one of Africa's oldest political parties, responsible for ending the apartheid regime in South Africa. Its road to freedom led it to Tanzania after it was banned in South Africa, where it had bases located in Morogoro, Iringa, Bagamoyo and Dar es Salaam. Mohamed Saidi worked for the Tanganyika Harbours Authority, and one of his tasks was to clear goods for the ANC. He says it was an honor when he was invited to visit the ANC headquarters in Mazimbo in 1979.
So Mohamed, can we invite you to Mazimbo, because you've been doing so much for us. We'd like you to come and see part of your efforts. And we went to Mazimbo for one night. They showed us the land which they were cultivating, the schools for the kids, all sorts of things. And we went all over the place. But really, things were happening there. They made it happen.
Some of the ANC elites during that time spent a significant part of their lives in Morogoro and used the Mazimbo campus, which is now Sokoine University, as a strategy center, something that the then President Nyerere fully supported.
So Mwalimu Nyerere was very accommodative to all countries which were not yet liberated. So that's why he accommodated all of them in order to ensure that mission of liberating all countries.
Academics believe that the ANC's freedom-fighting journey was an important one and that African nations could learn from it.
ANC has moved from scratch to this sophisticated scale you see nowadays, but it has passed a lot of problems. Fighting with the apartheid regime was not an easy task. It was one of the greatest stumbling blocks. But then we see nowadays ANC is one of the most democratic parties also. So we can learn democracy, tolerance, perseverance in the African continent.
The 5 ANC bases in Tanzania were handed back to the Tanzanian government in 1992. just 2 years before South Africa's independence. But despite this, many believe that the time spent by the ANC in Tanzania created a relationship that generations to come would be proud of. Daniel Kijo, SABC, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania.
As the ANC celebrates its 107th birthday, SABC News brings you live and uninterrupted coverage of events leading to its manifesto launch. Join us this Saturday for live coverage from Moses Mabhida Stadium on SABC News platforms from 6 a.m.
To be part of the SABC News team means
tell an independent and impartial African story.
I'm proud to be part of the SABC News team,
bringing business news to the man on the street and the executive in the boardroom.
We expose challenges faced by communities on a daily basis.
It is to take you behind the headlines, to show you the faces, and take you to the places that make this country beautiful.
And that's the power of the SABC, to go beyond the story.
I am SABC News.
I am SABC News.
I am SABC News.
And I am SABC News.
And to discuss the ANC's 107-year-old existence and how it's influenced or been influenced by various ties it's established, we're joined in the studio now by political economist Ms. Lebohang Pheko to talk a little bit more about the party and especially what it considers to be its liberation struggle credentials. It's something that it seems to hang on to quite a bit. So what would we characterize at this very point in a global village as liberation struggle movement?
Yeah, so I mean, there are several. I mean, the one thing is that these movements come from different places, different contexts, are often very much influenced by their immediate conditions. There were Latin American movements which of course arose in the 1800s and then of course across Asia, particularly and significantly the sort of movements which people like Mahatma Gandhi and Nehru were a part of. But the African context is slightly different because of the nature of settler occupation. And what most of these have in common is an anti-imperial, anti-colonial context, which is extremely important when it comes to South Africa, because one of the great misnomers has been that this was a struggle against racism, and of course it wasn't. It was about occupation of the economy, which still continues, occupation of land, and ongoing occupation even of ideas, the idea of what it means to be an African on the African continent today.
And the significance of its first international mission being in London, even its first international branch being in London, what was that?
So, I mean, similarly to other liberation movements, it was obviously a space in which to organize and to mobilize from afar. Several movements also had their bases there, the ANC, the PAC, other countries, even movements such as Frelimo, SWAPO and others also had bases in different countries. And of course it was because there was the need to have a base where people could mobilize from abroad in order to then galvanize international opinion, mobilize resources, financial as well as political resources, mobilize support, and to have a sense in which there was a space which is relatively free of danger in which to move information, material along through the ranks easily and effectively. It was also the opportunity to build future relations with, you know, as possible incoming incumbents, future relationships with peers across the world, London being a very strategic spot, and countries such as the United States also playing quite an important role.
I mean, obviously the fact that Oliver Tambo was there at the time was also very important and strategic, but the fact that the colonizer itself was
also there.
Exactly, in control of those movements, in control of those communications, and any progress that might have been made. Was there genuine belief that Britain would then reverse the dispossession and disempowerment of the majority of South Africans?
Look, you know, one of the early leadership cohort of the ANC petitioned King George. And they went and, you know, they wanted to take a trip over to the UK to petition against land dispossession, the land dispossession of the African majority. And that's the ANC that I think a lot of people, even today, would have great sympathy for, which was speaking around landlessness and understanding that this was not just a question of race relations and swimming pools and all of these things that are quite banal, but really a question of settler occupation. And one would also argue that perhaps this is the ANC from which there has been a great departure, because soon after that, within the ANC, of course, there were different elements which arose. The Africanist wave, which was then within the Youth League. So that would have been people like A.P. Mda, Anton Lembede, and Ndate Sobukwe, who would have thought that the pace of negotiations and that polite politics, that very gentlemanly politics, were really inappropriate for the kind of demands which were being made.
Okay, so we do understand that we were able to reach the head of the ANC's International Relations Committee, Lindiwe Zulu, on the line with us. Was a miscommunication. She was meant to be here in Johannesburg, but she's in Durban. Thank you so much, though, for taking the time to speak to us, Ms. Zulu, and thank you so much for accepting the invitation. Let's first start with the ANC's insistence on the character of its liberation struggle credentials. Why is that important for the ANC at the moment?
So the line is very bad. I can hardly hear you. So I can hardly hear. I didn't get the question.
Okay, so I was talking about the liberation struggle credentials, the importance thereof. It's something that you have been emphasizing at your 107-year-old anniversary, that primarily the character of the governing party remains that. Why is that?
It is that because we are still very far from a completely liberated South Africa, when the majority of black people are still living in poverty, when many of the people who are supposed to be having an economic empowerment are far from that. As long as the majority of black people in South Africa still have to continue to struggle for the basics, even if we are the one who are in government, it's not going to take us 25 years to change so many years of apartheid, so many years of segregation, so many years of economic exclusion. The reason why we remain a liberation movement, even up to date, is because in as far as our national democratic revolution is concerned, we are really still have a long way to go until such time that we feel the people of South Africa in general, and black in majority in particular, are in a better space than where they are right now.
One of the things that we're asking is about your influence on some of the regions that you occupy, but how they also influenced you. There's thinking by some that, especially when it comes to the former Soviet Union, that you and other liberation struggle movements became a pawn thereof, that you were dragged into the Cold War and therefore ingested those philosophies, those ideals.
No, I don't know what the Soviet Union has got anything to do with the debates that we're having here. Because if we want to talk about the Soviet Union or any other country that supported us in the liberation struggle, we'd have a different discussion altogether. Our ideology was not based or was not built by the Soviet Union or socialist countries whatsoever. Our basis for being was the fact that South Africa, black people were segregated, were oppressed, were brutalized, were not given the kind of life that they now have. Just try and imagine if South Africa had been a South Africa of the past 25 years, where South Africa would have been had we started that more than 300 years ago. We would be very far. So our ideology must be understood clearly, not on the basis of some other country, but on the basis of our own liberation struggle and the decision by people to say we don't want this apartheid regime. We are going to stand up and fight it collectively, by the way, because it was black South Africans, Africans, it was some white compatriots, it was Indian compatriots who all stood up and said we don't want this system. It had nothing to do with any Soviet Union or anything of that sort. However, the Soviet Union we are talking about is like other countries that supported us by ensuring that we get education, by ensuring that we get military training so that we can fight the apartheid regime.
Ms. Peko, I mean, recent fixation on South Africa's relationship with Russia in the past couple of years has tempted people to say this love affair between the two countries, which clouds South Africa's judgment. So as Ms. Zulu says, that is unfair to raise. What is your thinking around it?
I think that the kind of relationship that South Africa has been pursuing with the Soviet Union over the past few years, which is really not a state-led, but more personality-driven, would be quite different to the sort of camaraderie and the solidarity politics of 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And, you know, even the China that we're talking about, the Soviet Union that we're talking about, is entirely different. The ideologies have shifted. And also the idea of what liberation movements actually are or are not has actually shifted. And as much as I'm tempted to agree to a great extent with the minister, that there's still much to be done regarding social inequality and bridging the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest people in this country, which is race-based. I'm also tempted to think that when we speak in the language of liberation, we need to understand the architecture of what liberation movements were and are, and the context in which they operated, appreciating that those were really times of siege, almost war times. I mean, liberation wars were exactly that. They were wars. And there's a huge difference in the modalities of operation in a time of war, in a time of command, in a time of issuing orders and not wanting people to dissent, not expecting people to respond with any questions and so on. It's a case of go there, do that, fulfill this mission. And the transition from that to a governing party to a democratic institution is often very tricky, and I think that South Africa has to a great extent fallen prey to some of those contradictions and contestations.
Okay, we're going to focus on that when we do return. What is the architecture of liberation struggle movements now and then, and their modalities, as Ms. Peko has mentioned? We'll be back after this break.
On Media Monitor, we leave no stones unturned.
We don't have shared principles when it comes to media freedom.
From the integrity of journalists to accusations of fake news.
If anybody comes with an alternative view, he starts referring to it as fake news.
We also look at the safety of our journalists while covering stories on the field.
This is something that we're faced with daily, from journalists who say they've been physically or verbally attacked by community members.
Watch Media Monitor Sundays at 9 a.m.
We are at the forefront of Africa's tech discussion.
We're already planning for the 5G spectrum to be licensed by 2020.
In Mauritius, for fiber migration, we had a strategy. On network, we have gadgets, robots, and more.
We focus on investing in entrepreneurs and technology in emerging markets.
There's technology and social media news on Network with me, Spomenele Zondi, every Saturday at 8:30 p.m. and every Sunday at 5:30 p.m.
Welcome back. You're watching African Perspective. We're looking at the ANC, the oldest liberation struggle movement in Africa, as it celebrates its 107-year anniversary. We look at the ties that bind it here on the continent and beyond. So South Africa and Uganda have a shared past. 30 years ago, the East African country hosted South African liberation fighters. Ever since, Uganda has been hailed for its contribution towards South Africa's liberation fight. And as Leon Sasyange reports from Kampala, that history makes a very strong relation today.
At this military training school in central Uganda, one name,
Oliver Reginald Tambo still resonates. The Oliver Tambo Leadership School symbolizes Uganda's deep respect for the liberation leaders of South Africa.
Uganda has been interlinked with the struggles of South Africans, since the early ANC days and the anti-apartheid struggles. You realize that some of the training camps for Mukoto wa Sizwe and other South African struggleists who were fighting against apartheid were actually based here in Uganda. So there is a long standing history.
More than 3,000 freedom fighters trained at this center 3 decades ago. Their mission to achieve democracy and peace in South Africa. South Africa's ANC and Uganda's ruling party, the National Resistance Movement, have shared the same ideology in their fights for liberation.
It was very much a struggle for justice, was very much a struggle for equality, was very much a struggle for socio-economic transformation, was a struggle to make sure that you have inclusive growth, and was a struggle against racism.
And because of those shared goals, South Africa's relationship with Uganda has only grown closer. The bilateral relations between the two countries have been strengthened politically over the years, but even that relationship has been extended wider. Uganda is a strategic partner for South Africa in terms of trade and investment. Many South African companies are operating here, and by 2016, Uganda's imports from South Africa were worth nearly 3 trillion rand.
They trade with us, okay? We trade with them. And that's greatest, because the African survival is based on the African economic might. And South Africa is a mighty country economically in Africa.
4 post-apartheid heads of state have visited Uganda to strengthen relations. So the two close countries are on track to continue to build an even closer bond as they both work together to propel the continent forward. Leon Sanyanga, SABC News, Kampala, Uganda.
And we continue our conversation with Lindwe Zulu, head of the ANC's International Relations Committee, and Lebohang Pheko, political economist and senior research fellow at the Trade Collective. Let's come back to you, Minister Zulu. I'd like to start with the point that Ms. Pheko made, that we have to understand the context and the architecture of liberation struggle movements now and then. What would you say they are?
Well, obviously, we are now in a democratic South Africa, and therefore it means that some of the things that we have to focus on is now a South Africa that is free, still moving towards democracy, we call it democratic, still moving towards non-sexism, we're not there yet. So there has to be that understanding, obviously, that we are not in 1991 or 1990 as you've just been interviewing somebody in Uganda, where, by the way, some of us are products of having been, of having lived in that Uganda, being supported by Uganda. We had a lot of our soldiers that had to go not only for training, but also had to go to schools for ordinary education. And therefore, the understanding of the current situation is that we remain a liberation movement, but we are in government. And for us to really finally call ourselves a complete political party, it will only that will happen when the majority of South Africans feel the freedom that we are talking about. So while we are in a democracy, the bottom line is this: we are still struggling. The struggle continues for the majority of our people to make sure that we change their lives. We are here in Durban, for instance, not in Durban, but in KZN overall, as the African National Congress. Yes, we are here to celebrate the 107 years of the ANC, but we are also here to go and see for ourselves continuously the challenges that are faced by our people, the poverty that's still finding itself, and by the way, the opulence on the other hand, where you drive tracks and tracks of land, you see that there's a sugar cane fields this side, there's a plantation of trees and all that. And ask me, who does that belong to? And when a South African, black South African, and those who are previously disadvantaged, going to be pointing at that and saying, we also are part and parcel of the ownership of this economy that we are talking about.
Minister, allow me to bring on Ms. Peko here. At some point I saw you shaking your head vigorously, especially on how liberation struggle movements are still relevant, and especially in dealing with some of the challenges that South Africa, and I thought it was a good juxtaposition with Uganda, for instance, given the fact that others would argue that you've got a president that's been there for too long and that the incumbency thereof has skewed the nature of that liberation struggle movement or fight.
So I think when it's important to understand that there are very different mechanisms of being a party of liberation and of being a party in governance. So my one concern with the notion of the movement and a liberation movement is that it really skews the memory of who was and was not there, and that and I think that that's also part of a movement of anti-memory and anti-history, which monopolizes liberation and monopolizes the contributions made. So that's my first thing. The second is also that in then being a liberation movement and having stood for and standing for particular principles, democratic and liberation and anti-imperial principles, it is very difficult to then translate that into a new dispensation. And I think a whole bunch of scholars and I think a whole bunch of experiences that we can see across the continent illustrate the extent to which incumbency in and of itself, when a movement has not been able to, any movement, the ANC, ZANU, it could have been UNIP in Zambia, SWAPO, etc., has not managed to translate those forms of command structure from a vertical to a horizontal, from one that is far more collaborative and cooperative, and that wants to draw on people's different opinions and perspectives. There are going to be the difficulties that we're facing across the continent. The one is access to power, access to state resources, and because of this command structure and a culture of often very opaque relations, no questioning and very little dissent, it then is very difficult to translate that into something of a modern 21st century African-based democratic movement.
Minister, you objected to the manner in which I framed it. How would you then say we should trace or identify, even expand on what the essence of liberation is?
Yes, well, look, we are talking about people who are coming out of colonialism. And coming out of colonialism, you also still have another struggle, that of imperialism. So you cannot deny, and by the way, when you talk about liberation struggle and liberation movement, we do not, as the African National Congress, claim to have been the only liberation movement in South Africa. We have the PAC, they're still there, even if they have their problems, but they are still there. We had the Black Consciousness movement. Some of them are still there, even though they are not necessarily in the same position as the African National Congress, which democratically won elections and then started governing as expected by our constitution, which is the constitution that we collectively put together as South Africans. Now, I do not want us to mix issues here. Here, I thought the discussion is about the African National Congress, the 107 years of the African National Congress, its history, its ideology, and why it is still here today. And the issue of Uganda and other countries and other presidents being there longer than anybody else is not something that is South African. We have a constitution which, by the way, the ANC at all times abides to. That's why, for instance, right now we're going to be campaigning for elections 2019, because as a country, as the liberation movement, we believed that we needed to have the system that we have in South Africa, albeit with all its challenges. And our view as the ANC is that as we build in South Africa, there's still a lot of things that we're going to change. It doesn't mean that because we are governing in this way, we are doing things this way, we will stagnate in it. We will keep on improving our systems in such a way that they have to respond to the challenges of South Africans overall, all of them, but in particular, black South Africans who were oppressed.
And Minister, I think in all fairness, we are looking at the ANC from that regional perspective, the nature thereof, and its relationships. And Ms. Pekon, I'd like to come in and ask this question because the ANC, as a regional player, as a global player, has played a role in mediation, peacekeeping of some of the bigger conflicts on our continent. Can it really shirk its responsibility of some of the developments that we see on the continent?
So we need to distinguish between the ANC as a party, a political party or a political liberation movement, and the ANC's function as the government that is incumbent. And its role is exactly that, of course, to be part of the solidarity, the sorority and fraternity of states and nations, not only within the continent but also beyond. That is what we would expect of any government which wants to. But
some of those come from the strategic documents of the party.
They do,
on its foreign policy.
But the conflation between party and state has to be should be avoided. And if this is an ANC party political stance, which has then bled and been infused into the government position, that is entirely different because the government is not only a party. Remember that it's a host of stakeholders, the people who sit in parliament, the opposition, also part of governing. And I think that if we then don't draw that line in the sand, of course there's bound to be, because of the majority and because of course they're the governing party, certainly the positions of the party are bound to infuse into state policy, but they are not synonymous.
And Ms. Zulu, I would imagine that that's something that you would agree with, although your critics, your detractors on some of the policies that you proffer would say that there's a narrowing of spaces. Do you agree?
Yes, unfortunately, the line is just so bad, but if I understood you very well, yes, I can say that the system that we adopted in South Africa in 1994 is that there is a governing party, and in this case is the African National Congress, and we need to be understood that we are serving the entire nation. We are not just serving ourselves and our members as the African National Congress. And therefore, you will from time to time find that challenge between the implementation of the ANC's own policies across the board. An example would be, it's not to say everybody who is working in government, for instance, is a member of the ANC. And in some instances, you find resistance where we come in as an ANC and say, this is how we see things and this is how things should be done. But others kind of like feel, yes, you are an ANC, but when we are here, you are not the ANC as in the party, you are the ANC in government. In a new democracy, that's why I'll keep on going back to the fact that we are new in democracy as a country, and we must be open to finding the best ways and the best systems that would work for us as South Africans in general. But of course, every party that gets into government would find that it would do exactly what the ANC is doing. It will change things in order for things to fit its own belief and its own approach. So the African National Congress would not be different that much, but the difference would be there.
Okay, we're going to have to, I'm afraid. Thank you so much for your time and speaking to us, clarifying some of those positions. Lindiwe Zulu is head of the ANC's International Relations Committee here in the studio with us. Ms. Lebohang Pheko, political economist, and we'll be back with more from the foreign desk in just a moment.
As the ANC celebrates its 107th birthday, SABC News brings you live and uninterrupted coverage of events leading to its manifesto launch. Join us this Saturday for live coverage from Moses Mabhida Stadium on SABC News platforms from 6 a.m.
So looking at what Africans think about the 107-year-old anniversary of the ANC, Sarah Kimani took to the streets of Kenya to hear how some view the party in that country.
It's well known in the world because it contributed towards the liberation of South Africa from white rule in 1994. So ANC is known for its liberation, a struggle which was successful in South Africa and which brought about democracy for the first time.
You see, ANC has a history. People like Steve Biko, people like Luthuli, people like Nelson Mandela. And you know, the struggle for the independence of South Africa was not an easy task. So other new parties like in Kenya, the smaller parties, they should emulate parties like ANC.
In Africa? It's not bad. They've lost their goal because they've gone into multi-party and tribalism and all that. So the essence of what they were fighting before has gone out.
Before, by the time of Mandela, it was good, but nowadays it's checking also.
So as South Africa's governing party, the African National Congress, commemorates its 107 years in existence, we take a look at Nigeria, Africa's most populous country. It was involved in the struggle during the apartheid era as well. Correspondent Phil Ihaza reports from Nigeria's capital, Abuja.
The ANC's fight against apartheid received significant support from a number of African countries and especially Nigeria.
Nigeria was a key player or a key stakeholder in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. So much so that apart from the one-on-one relationship the Nigerian leaders had with the ANC leadership, you find Nigeria playing a very crucial and important role at the level of multilateralism. And so you find within ECOWAS, within the then Organization of African Unity, and within the UN, Nigeria tried to raise the consciousness of, the other countries, member countries of the UN, to what was happening in Southern Africa.
The post-apartheid era further led to stronger bilateral relationship between South Africa and Nigeria, which saw migration of their citizens to either of both countries. But in the last decade, the robust ties between Nigeria and South Africa have suffered setbacks, ranging from a series of xenophobic attacks to sour diplomatic tensions and a prolonged rivalry for economic and political dominance in Africa.
I call it irritants in relations between Nigeria and South Africa. But by and large, those two countries are very pivotal in lifting Africa up from where it is now to where it should be. And I think the more the two countries cooperate with each other and smoothing over the irritants, the better it will be, not just for both peoples of both countries, but also for the African continent.
In addition, analysts say in order to prevent further irritants from occurring between two of Africa's economic giants, more needs to be done to educate younger generations of both countries on the relationship between the leadership of South Africa's ANC and Nigeria during the period of the struggle. Phil Ihaza, SABC News, Abuja, Nigeria.
And we continue our discussion with Ms. Lebohang Pheko, who's a political economist. So I'd like to talk about Nigeria and the conversation we had earlier on with the ANC's head of international relations, especially how South Africa has been viewed. It's been called a big brother, or accused of having the big brother syndrome. And at some point there were tensions with a country like Nigeria. How is it viewed now regionally, and how is its role viewed?
South Africa or the ANC?
Or the ANC.
And it's important to separate the two,
as you mentioned.
Yeah, so I think there's still a level of hostility between South Africa and Nigeria, and I think that, as the minister mentioned and alluded to, this bleeding of ANC policy agendas and policy frameworks into state policy frameworks is quite tricky. And what this has done is it's also made it very difficult, I think, for countries to relate to South Africa as an equal partner. I think that in many respects we're considered a big brother, but of course in many respects South Africa and the ANC-led government, but South Africa is also one of the biggest contributors. So there's a peace dividend that we've contributed to. Countries like Somalia, Sudan, Burundi, Rwanda, Central African Republic have benefited from these negotiating skills, benefited financially, benefited also from peacekeeping forces, and so on and so forth.
And I'd imagine their presence in groups like the G7 and the coalition with BRICS.
And right now as well, you know, chairing the Security Council. And these are not insignificant steps at all. But I think that yes, it seems as though certainly, despite all of this, the demarcation between what it means then, I think, is between a liberation party and a governing one has to be made much more clear. And I would still like to insist, however, that it's impossible to talk about the history of the ANC without talking about the history of other political movements in this country. And it's also very important that when we speak of liberation, it should not be considered as a movement, the movement. Even the language of the movement is very
Hold the thought, Ms. Pickle, because I actually want us to delve into that, especially the Southern African region, what those relationships have meant, how they've influenced each other. Zimbabwe being a very strong ally of the ANC, the governing party ZANU-PF says it will continue to strengthen its relations with the ANC. Our correspondent there spoke to ZANU-PF spokesperson Simon Moyo and also took to the streets to speak to Zimbabweans, ordinary Zimbabweans.
These are comrades. The ANC is a sister liberation movement. We were in trenches together. We fought together. You'll recall, of course, in 1967 that we even had a joint military operation in Hwange and Spolilo under what you used to call the Lutuli detachment, fighting a common enemy here in then Rhodesia, and of course in South Africa, because they were supported by South Africa here. So we come a long way together, and we are saying to them, this is our day together. We wish them, of course, the best of the celebrations. We wish them, of course, also the best in terms of their vision, in terms of the future. They have stated openly to us that they are on a renewal path, that they are on a unity path. And those are the same principles and visions we have with them. So we're together, we are one.
We do not expect revolutionary parties to be relevant.
And still in the Southern African region, the collapse of apartheid and the advent of democracy in South Africa was regionally supported by a joint effort of the frontline states. Following the Soweto uprising in 1976, the Kingdom of Lesotho's proximity to South Africa played a pertinent role in educating and harboring many ANC cadres.
Pius XII, now known as the National University of Lesotho, was a melting pot and a politically vibrant place for most African students in pursuit of education and African liberation.
Pius XII was the seat of liberation in a sense. Students would even smuggle top people to come and give political lectures just to keep the spirit going.
The apartheid regime made it unbearable for the high-profile ANC cadres and their families. The late former ANC secretary, Mendi Msimang's sister, witnessed firsthand the wrath of the regime.
He left Roma and he was articled with the Mandela Tambo unit. So it was not easy for him with that group already. When they were arrested, I took food to them at John Foster. When they were released, I was the one who was sent to make sure that he was comfortable. When his family left, the children now, I was the one who took them to a strange place I didn't even know, where I left them. And they were my sister-in-law with the children were taken away. And that's how they landed in India.
Many believe that ANC needs to regain trust as the party that can protect the rights of Africans when it comes to the land debate.
There is scope, there is room to improve the land debate and take the land debate not back to the Congress of the People in the 50s, back to 1912, and then show the full relevance of the African National Congress, why it was formed. It was formed to protect the rights of Africans, to protect the rights of Africans in their lands. That is why there were 8 kings that were involved.
And as a young person, I would remember this Ngobeni, and Edward Ngobeni. He was only 21 years old in 1985 when he was imprisoned for 4 years. He had that message of O.R. Tambo, and he was actually playing it to his friends. And that was actually a scene to that apartheid movement. So I would want to congratulate ANC as a party for having been in power since 1994, because now they are liberated, I would say.
I wish to congratulate the ANC for the breakthrough it has done in keeping the spirit of going forward.
I would always congratulate the ANC, but at this point in time, because my view is that they have lost their way, my congratulation is qualified.
107 years down the line, with apartheid struggle won, ANC is here to appease its followers that it remains the party of choice to pave a new path to lead the masses with sound political and economical agenda of the modern times. Rabelang Khatebe, SABC News, Maseru, Lesotho.
And just to bring that all together, Ms. Lebohang Pheko, look at, especially as I mentioned, the Southern African regions, the similarity, if at all, or how the parties in these countries influenced each other in the direction that they've taken or not taken at the moment.
The one thing is, I think that to pick up from the clip, the historical connection between ZANU and ANC wasn't really there. It was actually between ZAPU, which was the ANC in Zimbabwe, or at the time Southern Rhodesia, and ANC, and I think we should be historically accurate, and that was where the real alliance were. And at some point, ZANU, what we now call ZANU, was more Africanist inclined. Secondly, the whole idea of the ANC as being the custodians of the land debate is absolutely erroneous. I mean, one of the great departures and why it's impossible to discuss the ANC without discussing other liberation movements was, of course, 1955, the Kliptown Charter, where the land debate was the cause of the biggest split from, the Pan-Africanist Congress, which was the Lembede, Sobukwe, Mda, well, Lembede was then late, but Mda faction, which then said that we cannot have a situation where we're told that land belongs to all. And I think that the ANC's return to this debate is quite opportunistic, and it's certainly, they have not been the vanguard of that discussion. That has been led by the Azanian bloc, if one may say so. But lastly, to say that the notion of the similarities of between the many liberation movements within Southern Africa is undoubted, but there's also a problematic to that, which is what was, the few movements which were labeled as the authentic ones. So one would have been ANC, one would have been ZANU, one would have been SWAPO, Frelimo, and so on, and MPLA, and so on. And what most of them have done is they have been then putrefied into movements which have then had access to power, but have not democratized relations. Now, so what would you say then is the biggest challenge in modernizing? I think it's the idea of what is separating a movement from a governing party. The first. I think it's quite interesting that we can't talk about a liberation movement when we have an African-led government. Liberated from whom? From the very African-led government? Why is there no social justice, inequality, land restitution 24 years after an African-led government came into power? So I think that the complexity of this is mired even more. Then that means, then, do we now need liberating from the liberators?
Having said that, has there been real social re-engineering, not only in South Africa, given the fact that the ANC is the oldest liberation struggle movement, but from all other liberation struggle movements on the continent?
So, I mean, I think what has happened with a lot of former liberation movement is that they have then fallen prey to a few things. The one is access to power, excessive authoritarianism in some respects, state-led authoritarianism, and the very same conflation between state and government, state, party, and government. The tendency to evoke liberation credentials, which the ANC in particular, and in common with many other movements, is fond of doing, which is, I think, is in some way an attempt to silence debate, silence dissent, or silence multiple voices. If anything, liberation should have been about liberating multiple memories, the many contributions of the many movements in this country and beyond this country, and the many voices which have contributed to this liberation and are continuing to be the architects of it. But I think that if we're going to speak in a monolithic way about a movement and a particular struggle as though there was one and one only, it feeds back into this notion of the authenticity of only one and the absolute erasure of others, which is quite unacceptable.
In a word, is it still relevant, the ANC as a liberation struggle movement, especially its role and mandate on the continent?
Look, I think that this mandate on the continent is overstated, firstly. And I think that its role historically is also overstated. It is not the movement which, for example, was successful in expelling South Africa from the United Nations. That came about through the Sharpeville Uprising, which was not led by the ANC, for example. So I think that, yes, its role is as relevant as any post-liberation movement at this stage in its trajectory, 20-25 years.
And that's a good point to leave it on. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very
much. Your insights. Ms. Lebohang Peko is a political economist. That's all we've had time for tonight on this episode of African Perspective. Thank you so much for joining us. So from all of us here, good night. The Globe is next.
A space for every woman in South Africa.
I want to speak to the women who cannot